How's everyone doing? Good. Halfway through the week, right? Closer to the weekend than to Monday. All right. So, some of you who were, or most of you who were here last time, my name is Tahmid. I'm a former Muslim, became Christian, and I just have been sharing some things that I have learned about apologetics, and I'm just sharing that wisdom with you guys. And today we're going to dive back into it, but before that, I have a pop quiz for you guys. So here's the thing. I have, if you can answer my question, I have candy for you guys. So let's start off with the first question. Next slide should have it. Okay. What is apologetics? All right. All right, Sam, go for it. Okay, no. You gotta have it in your heart. Whatever you have to say, you gotta have it in your heart. No. I appreciate that, but you gotta take the notes in here. That's what I needed at. All right, go for it, man. Okay, all right. Close enough answer. All right, there we go. Pick a prize, any prize. Let's go. And I'll send Lachlan one too because he attempted an answer and he was pretty close. So there you go, man. There you go. All right, second question. So we talked about a few apologists last time. Name one. All right, put your phone away. All right. What is it? Okay, I'll give you on the pronunciation, but yes, Nabil Qureshi. He's the one that I listened to, and he's the one who really made me think about Jesus and Islam. All right. Next question. Name one of the evidences we spoke of from last week. What was it called? Huh? The pillar. All right, let's give somebody else a chance. I know you want the candy. So it's a stone. What was it? It had some kind of writing. The pilot stone. There we go. Pilot stone. Go for it, man. All right. So, two prophets from the Old Testament. Isaiah and Jeremiah. All right, man. There you go. Good job. Bonus, anyone tell me two other prophets? Yeah. Okay. All right. Next question. How many manuscripts of the New Testament exist? 11. No. What'd you say? 2 million? Okay. Ooh. All right, Sam. So it is 20,000. So 20 to 25,000 manuscripts of the New Testament. All right. So there you go. Hey, you were not confident enough. I need you to be confident in your heart. You know the answer. All right. So that's all the quiz we had. But for everyone who couldn't be here, and just for a recap, so we talked about what apologetics is. Apologetics is a process to help defend Christianity, but it's also just a process of answering questions of unbelievers or new believers, anyone who has questions about Christian faith, right? And we talked about why we do apologetics. I kind of shared my reasoning for it, why. Growing up as a Muslim and having to talk to my parents about Christianity, I need to be able to tell them why I believe what I believe. And we also talked about Romans 10:14, which talks about how if you, how will they become, I'm paraphrasing this, but how will they become believers if we don't tell them, right? Like how will anyone believe in Jesus or in God? So we talked about the authenticity of the Bible, the 20,000 manuscripts, textual criticism. Anyone can tell me what textual criticism is? So textual criticism is actually like there's so many copies of the Bible, it kind of backs itself up. So like if 10,000 copies say the same thing, we can consider it to be proof that, hey, this is legitimate. So we talked about external evidences. So we talked about the pilot stone, we talked about Teldan steel, and we talked about a tablet. It's called the Cebu Sarsakim tablet. So those were the other. Okay, I'll believe you on that. All right. Yes, she remembers that it looked like a soap and it was red, so it's okay. So, and then internal evidences, obviously, like we talked about prophecies, like how the Bible kind of fulfills prophecies, and they have been fulfilled geographically and through Jesus. Some addition to that, I missed a couple of points when I was talking last week. So a lot of people will come out and complain against you saying, okay, so there's 20,000 copies, but they have errors in them. So how can we believe that? So the errors that exist in those are spelling mistakes and like very like little omissions that don't change the core message of the Bible. So if you ever have a friend who you tell them and like, hey, there's 20,000 copies, and they're like, well, the 20,000 copies have like mistakes in them, and like, you should tell them, yes, they have mistakes in them, but those mistakes don't affect the core message of the Bible. All right? Cool. And the other point, apologetics is not salvation. Apologetics will not bring you to Jesus. Apologetics is a deeper way of understanding who God is and a deeper way of getting to dive into Scripture and really understanding the meaning of what Jesus is saying, what God is telling us, and how we have to live our lives. Salvation only comes through Jesus. Can we agree to that? Okay. All right. So with all that said, let's dive into what we have for today. So next slide, please. So here's my question for today. There are 3 photos up there. Can anyone tell me what's common about these 3 photos? Zoe? Okay. So there's like okay, go for it. Sin, you're close. Yes. Mm-hmm.
With like the Holy Ghost. With like the Holy Ghost came and then like they didn't.
Okay. All right.
Okay, so Adam and Eve sinned, right? And so that caused like the whole like sin thing, and you weren't able to. And so you had to make a sacrifice for your sin, so you were able to speak to the Lord, and like Passover. No, but I'm showing how they connect.
Okay. So okay, what's your name again?
I'm Avery.
Avery, as much as people want to make fun of Avery, she's kind of on the right track. So the commonality of this is sacrifice. It required sacrifice. So Adam and Eve, what are they wearing? Lambskin. Did lambskin just get created out of its own, or did something need to be sacrificed? Yeah. And during Passover, they had to sacrifice lambs. They had to put the lamb, like unblemished lamb, they had to sacrifice those and put their blood on their doors. So, what are we talking about today? Jesus. All right, so the point was we were talking about Jesus. So because everything begins with God and comes with Jesus, right? So now who is Jesus? we talk about Jesus is God, right? Like if you go to Sunday school, that's what you're taught. Jesus is God. God is Jesus. It's very simple. But to the world, is this Jesus with blonde hair, blue-eyed, white baby skin? Or is this guy Jesus with the American flag around his shoulders? No. Maybe it's this guy, right? Right? We don't know. That's the thing. We don't know what he looked like. There were no photographs. And if you read the Bible, there's never a point where anybody says Jesus was 7 foot tall, had white teeth. Nobody said these things. Why? Because it doesn't matter. It does not matter what he looks like. It matters who he was and how he lived his life. But to the historians out there, it does matter. They need to know who Jesus is. I can point to you 2 historians who were from that time period. One of them was called Flavius Josephus, who was a Rasiphus. No, I'm just kidding. I just thought I should rhyme it. So Flavius Josephus was a Pharisee by nature. Do you guys know what a Pharisee is? So very strict Jews at that time. So he was a historian for them. He would record all Jewish history at that time. And this is what Flavius Josephus says about Jesus. About this time, there lived Jesus, a wise man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing amongst us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. Not disappeared. Yeah. So Flavius is like talking as a Jew about Jesus and saying like, there was this guy who had like surprising feats, yada, yada, yada. So he's recording history of that time period. This is verified history outside of the Bible of who Jesus is. Let me give you another example. There was Tacitus. He was a Roman senator at that time, I think about 60 years after Jesus' time. And he recorded that time, the period of Jesus, and this is what he has to say. So keep in mind, Tacitus is Roman. Romans did not like Jews. They sure did not like Christians. And this is what he says. But all human efforts and all the lavish gifts of the emperor and the propitiations of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration was the result of an order. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians, by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of the procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. So he's calling Christianity like, what is the word that he used? He called it a superstition, an abomination. So he has no reason to talk about Jesus in this manner of like recording him in history. What does he have to gain from it? And yet he has recorded him. So there is proof that shows that there was recorded history of who Jesus of Nazareth was from that time period, not just from the Bible. And at this time, current scholarship, so I've mentioned these 3 scholars, Mars Casey, Bart Ehrman, Joseph Hoffman, they're all atheists. They don't believe in any God, let alone Jesus. And these are some of the things they have said about Jesus of Nazareth. They say, Mars Casey said, I therefore conclude that the myth argument is completely spurious from beginning to end, mainly put forth by incompetent and unqualified people, most of whom were former fundamentalist Christians who are not aware of critical scholarship and are not aware of proper scholarship now. They frequently confuse any New Testament with fundamentalist Christianity. Bart Ehrman said, I do not discuss myths on Jesus in my classroom, as that does not hold a foothold or even a toehold in the historicity of Jesus. And Joseph Hoffman, he said that the disease these buggers spread is ignorance disguised as common sense. They're the single greatest threat to fundamentalism, to calm and academic study of religion, touting the scientific method as the operating mode while ignoring its application. So what these guys are saying, these are like scholars. They read New Testament for fun. Like that's what they do. They try to study it, they try to understand it, analyze it. And they're saying the whole idea of Jesus being a myth is not an argument. It's probably the silliest thing anyone can ever tell you if they actually used common sense and education. So that's my conclusion on that. Like Jesus of Nazareth being a true being is not a question to be asked. So then the next question is, what does the Bible say about Jesus, right? So we talk about Jesus as a Messiah. But before I say that, have you ever liked a sequel more than the prequel? Like The Dark Knight more than the first Dark Knight movie, right? Empire Strikes Back more than, no? So we do that with the Bible sometimes. We love the New Testament. We like to read Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, but when I mention Numbers and Deuteronomy, everyone doesn't want to talk about it because it is kind of boring, it is historical. He's the son of him, he's the son of him, he's the son of him, da-da-da-da-da. But the prequel has to exist for the sequel to make sense, right? If there was no Toy Story 1, Toy Story 4 would not make sense on its own. Can we agree? So with that same idea, we cannot understand who Jesus is unless we read the Old Testament. And what does the Old Testament talk about when it talks about the Messiah? And I will caution this because the point I'm trying to make is I want you guys to be able to read the Old Testament and find Jesus in there. So Jesus is being mentioned in the Old Testament, which is written hundreds of years before the New Testament is being written. But here's the caution. Sometimes we try to insert our ideas into the Bible, and I have seen several pastors do it too, where it's like, you're not onto something, but you're probably on something. For those who did not understand that, good job. For the others who did, that's okay. So what I'm trying to say is don't try to insert Jesus into every verse. Like don't just say like, oh, this verse talks about Jesus. Why? Because I said so. Like that's not how it works. The New Testament actually gives good guidelines on how we can make sure that we are really reading or we are finding Jesus in the Old Testament. So here's an example. I used this verse before, right? Isaiah 7:14. In my last week, I mentioned this verse as a prophecy that's fulfilled. So Isaiah 7:14 says, "All right then, the Lord himself will choose the sign. Look, the virgin will conceive a child. She will give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel. God is with us." This is written 700 years before, and it is referenced by Matthew in Matthew 1:22-23. What does Matthew 1:22-23 says? It says specifically, all of this occurred to fulfill the Lord's message through his prophet. Look, the virgin will conceive a child, she will give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel. So what Matthew is doing is trying to explain to you as a reader, hey, this is not something new. This has been told in the Old Testament. That's why we know that this is the Messiah. Another example of it is Micah 5:2. I've mentioned that too, and Micah 5:2 talks about how the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. And this is referenced by Matthew again in Matthew 2:5-6. In Bethlehem in Judea, they said, "For this is what the prophet wrote, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the ruling cities of Judah, for a ruler will come from you who will be shepherd for my people Israel." So again, he's giving you, the New Testament writers are giving you examples of how to find Jesus in the Old Testament. So here's my biggest example of how you can find Jesus in the Old Testament. So it's Isaiah 53. And I will read Isaiah 53 to you guys because I want you to get the full message. So give me a moment. So to start Isaiah 53, I would like to start at Isaiah 52. Here's another interesting fact. The Bible wasn't created in chapters. Nobody, like Isaiah, when he wrote his writings down, it was not 52, the chapter 52 will have 10 verses. Like, it was not written like that. So oftentimes you will find stories in the Bible where a chapter ends and it's ends on a cliffhanger, yeah? And then on the next chapter, it's like, da-da-da-da-da-da. It's connecting that story. So sometimes the people who made those chapter breaks did not do a good job of doing that. But that doesn't defeat the purpose of the Bible stories itself. So here's an example of that. So Isaiah 52, verse 13 says, "See, my servant will prosper, he will be highly exalted, but many were amazed when they saw him. His face was so disfigured he seemed hardly human, and from his appearance one would scarcely know he was a man. And he will startle many nations. Kings will stand speechless in his presence, for they will see what they had not been told. They will understand what they had not heard about." Then you go into Isaiah 53:1, it says, "Who has believed our message? To whom has the Lord revealed his powerful arm?" It's a question. "My servant grew up in the Lord's presence like a tender green shoot, like a root in dry ground. There was nothing beautiful or majestic about his appearance, nothing to attract us to him. He was despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with deepest grief. We turned our backs on him and looked the other way. He was despised and we did not care. Yet it was our weaknesses he carried, it was our sores that weighed him down. And when he thought his troubles were punishment from God, a punishment for his own sins, but he was pierced for our rebellion, crushed for our sins. He was beaten so we could be whole. He was whipped so we could be healed. All of us like sheep have strayed away. We have left God's path to follow our own, yet the Lord laid on him the sins of us all. He was oppressed and treated harshly, yet he never said a word. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep is silent before the shearers, he did not open his mouth." This is 700 years before Jesus of Nazareth comes, right? And in this time period, Isaiah is telling his people, we are the ones who are going to neglect him. Who neglected Jesus? The Pharisees did. The Jewish leaders did. When Jesus was asked to defend himself in the court trials, he stayed silent. Who carried his cross up to the field? Who stood for our sins? This is all being written 700 years prior to that. Like, the current theology of any Christ follower is being written 700 years before that, and it's right there. This is what I would consider the heartbeat of the Bible. Like, if you had to explain to a new believer what we believe and why we believe in this upside-down kingdom, right? This king who sacrificed himself so that we could live well, so that we could be healed, so that our hearts could be to him. So, it's one of the most interesting passages in the Old Testament. Isaiah is very good. If you guys have time to kill between classes, I would suggest reading a chapter from Isaiah. Maybe start at chapter 40, because chapter 40 through the end is all prophecies, and it's all things that you can read about. You can try to find connections with the New Testament. So moving from that, I'll talk about Christophanies. Now, Christophanies are not epiphanies. Christophanies are something it's a term used to say literal figure. What's the correct way to say? Physical, literal appearance of Jesus in the Old Testament stories. So, how did you guys know that Jesus or God sometimes appeared in human form in the Old Testament? Can anyone give me an example? I have two up there. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Moses in the burning bush, yes, yeah. So that was like in a literal burning bush, like the God's essence was there. So that's what the Old Testament is talking about. It's talking about, there's a story in Genesis 18. I'm not going to read Genesis 18 to you, bore you guys anymore. But Genesis 18 talks about when Abraham is like just on the side of the street and three men appear to Abraham. And then Abraham immediately knows one of them is God. And then he has breakfast with God, and this is what he does. He's like, all right, God, I'll make you breakfast. So he runs right to his wife. He's like, you got to cook up something. And then they eat breakfast, and they eat food together, and they talk. And that was like one of the first appearances of God in person. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is like a very common story. So there were these three guys who were not going to listen to a decree that was made by a king at that time. And the decree was like, you have to worship my gold statue. And these three guys were like, no. So the king was really upset with them. So the king dragged them over and took them to this huge fiery furnace and threw these three guys in there and was like, all right, these guys are going to die in there, right? So then all of a sudden, one of them they see like there's this fourth figure kind of just walking around in the fire with them. Have you tried to walk in fire? It's not possible. So there are these four guys that are walking in the fire, and that fourth person is God with them. Why? Because they stood for God in that moment, not worshiping the gold statue, and they were saved through that. So those are two big examples of Christophanies. The reason I'm mentioning that is I have said it's a Christophany, right? I'm saying Jesus is God. But it's not an easy an answer as we think it is. Has anyone here heard about the Nicene Creed? Yeah? So what can you tell me about that? Like, what does that, or not the Nicene Creed, but what is the Council of Nicaea? Can anyone say anything? No? So the Council of Nicaea is like this big gathering of religious folks from that time period in 325 AD, so about 300 years after Jesus' life. And they were discussing all these like big theological questions of like, what do we believe in? Who is Jesus? And they seriously were having arguments of like, is Jesus created? Or is Jesus was there from the beginning? Like right now we live in this time period where we know this fact, but at that time it was not fact. It was still something that was debated because of controversies being created by smaller religious groups. So yes, to our answer, is Jesus God? Yes. All right, good job. We'll see you next week. But it's not that easy. So why is that not easy? So we're going to have to go dig deeper into the Bible. And the reason we have to dig that answer in the Bible, no person outside of the Bible is going to tell you that Jesus is God. You cannot, no Muslim is going to tell you that Jesus is God. No Hindu is going to tell you that Jesus is God. No Jew is going to tell you that Jesus is God. Because it would be like defeating their own doctrines. It would not match with their theology and what they believe in. For example, it would be like saying, like, if you guys said X country is the greatest country in the world and it was not the US, right? Like you grew up in the US and you're like, no, this other country is greater than what my country is. So you're putting that ahead of whatever your country is. So that's an example. I'm not trying to start a battle on what country is the best country in the world. All right. So in the Bible, there are multiple occasions that Jesus is asked the question, if you are God, but he never really says that. If you read the New Testament, he will never say, Jesus, I'm God. Nice to meet you. Here's my card. He never tells you that. What he does do is answer very critical questions that are being asked of him at very critical times. So in Mark 2:10, he is healing a man, and some of the Pharisees ask him, like, or he's about to heal a man, and then he says, son, I forgive your sins. And the Pharisees, who are like in this corner, crouching over to him, and they're like, how can you heal his sins. You're not God. And I'm like, no, that's exactly what I am. Like, I can forgive sins. Who else can forgive sins? No one else. God only can forgive sins. And then we look at Mark 2:28. He's about to heal someone on the Sabbath day. Now, for some of you guys who don't, guys and girls, who don't know what the Sabbath is, it's a day of rest. Jews maintain it to the 10th degree. They don't do anything on those days. They don't even use electricity. Like in modern day Sabbath, they don't use electricity. Most families may play board games and like have candles, and they probably make their food even before Sabbath begins, so that they don't have to cook. So Jesus was healing someone on Sabbath. He asked this man, "Hey, pick up your mat and walk." And the Pharisees are like, "You can't heal anybody on the Sabbath. The Sabbath is the day for rest. God rested on that day." And then this is what Jesus says. Jesus says, "The Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. So the Son of Man," that is Jesus, "is Lord, even over Sabbath." You know where else is the Sabbath mentioned? In the 10 Commandments. In that prequel book, the Old Testament, it's mentioned there, the 10 Commandments. And he's saying he's Lord over the Sabbath. He's saying he's Lord over all 10 Commandments. Who is the Lord over all 10 Commandments? Really quiet. All right. So God is, so what I'm trying to get to you guys is that he may not have answered that question directly, and you will have someone ask you that. They will be like, "Jesus never said he's God, so how can you say that?" And yes, my voice is very cranky when I get like that. But Jesus didn't have to answer that question, because he answered these particular doctrinal things about what God can do. And I can keep giving you examples after examples of when he does that. John 10:30 says, "The Father and I are one." John 8:19 says, "If you knew me, you would also know my Father." John 12:45 says, "For when you see me, you're seeing the one who sent me." Who sent Jesus? Who sent the Messiah? So he's saying, "For when you see me, you're seeing the one who sent me." And then the classical verses, right? You read John 1:1. Can someone tell me what John 1:1 is? This might be a candy question. If anyone can say what John 1:1 is. You know John 3:16. That's awesome. I want to know what John 1:1 says. So the first verse is, "In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God." So these are the first 3 verses. And in John 1:14 it says, "So the Word became human and made his home among us. He was full of unfailing love and faithfulness, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the Father's one and only Son." So the reason I really want to talk about all of this, and this is how I'll end, we just went through Easter. We talk about Easter as a time of recollection and understanding what Jesus' sacrifice was. And I just wanted to really dig deeper into that point of, guys, like he didn't have to do this. He didn't have to carry the cross. He didn't have to die for us. He didn't have to do any of that. We don't deserve to live. We don't deserve to live, nor do we deserve any peace in our life or mercy. The only reason we get that is because God decided to send his only Son to come take over all of our sins. So that's how I want to end today. Thank you all. Any questions you guys have, ask me later. But I thank you all for today's time, and we're getting to go early today. That's good.